6 News. I'm Lauren Wall.
And I'm Georgia Rowe.
And tonight is December 31st, 1969, and we're going to do a recap over the past decade before we jump into the new year. To kick things off, we're going to go to Danny out in the field.
Thank you, Lauren. To start off our decades recap, I'm going to talk about entertainment, specifically movies and television. The biggest change that the 60s saw was the transition to color television from the initial black and white. The change was first seen in movie theaters, but quickly progressed to televisions, and now almost every family owns a color television in their home. The 60s also saw the creation of the multiplex theater, with the first one being created by Stanley H. Durwood. The idea was a success and quickly spread nationwide. The 60s produced some great TV shows, with the first ones being ones that came from previous established radio shows, such as the Jack Benny program, The Today Show, and CBS Evening News. The 60s also saw the creation of some great soap operas, such as The Andy Griffin Show, Twilight Zone, Days of Our Lives, and The Coronation Street, which I think will go on until 2005 and produce as many as 6,000 episodes. The 60s also produced some great movies, such as To Kill a Mockingbird, based on the famous selling book by Harper Lee, and also A Raisin in the Sun, which tells the story of an African American trying to pursue the American dream. It also paved the way for some great franchises, such as James Bond with the production of Goldfinger. This pretty much wraps up the changes for movies and televisions in the 60s. To continue our recap for the decades, here are some previous clips from earlier these last 10 years.
Yesterday, August 28, 1963, over 200,000 Americans gathered in Washington, D.C. for a political rally known as the March on Washington. It was organized by civil rights and religious groups. The event was designed to shed light on political and social challenges that African Americans continue to face throughout the country. This march became a key movement in the growing struggle for civil rights in the U.S. Entertainment consisted of speeches and performances from John Lewis, Josephine Baker, Mahalia Jackson, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. In 1941, after a first attempt at a march came to light, FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which forbade discrimination by any defense contractors and established the Fair Employment Practices. 2 million blacks were employed in defense work by the end of 1944 as a result. The 1963 march commanded national attention by preempting regularly scheduled TV programs. Due to worries about possible rioting, the Pentagon rallied 19,000 troops, moved inmates to other prisons to make room, and D.C. banned the sale of alcohol. The march began at the Washington Monument and was scheduled to progress to the Lincoln Memorial with a program of music and speakers.
Thanks, guys. I'm currently outside a local college. Inside, there's an anti-war protest going on. Originally, these students held peaceful protests and marches in the street, but over these last few months, protests have become violent. Most students are involved in the counterculture movement, breaking social norms of the 50s. In extreme cases, some protests have resulted in the burning down of ROTC buildings and the arrest of students, while some roads are blocked and classes are canceled. When asked why they protest, the typical response is that at the age of 18, they are allowed to be drafted and die for the country, but legally can't vote or drink, which makes an understandable argument. Hopefully, the 26th Amendment will be passed granting suffrage to 18-year-olds. As a nation, we have discovered it is nearly impossible to win a war with a nation divided. President Nixon has made an attempt to address the silent majority who support the war, but with the help of broadcast television, support for the war dwindles.
Alright, hi, Daniel Verone here, and I'm on the streets of Washington, D.C. right now. On this day, July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act has just been passed under President Lyndon B. Johnson. The act outlaws discrimination based on race, sex, or national origin. It also ends unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, workplaces, and public accommodations. The act was first proposed by JFK in his civil rights speech presented on June 11, 1963. The speech was brought upon by the many notable protests, civil rights protests, the most notable one being the Birmingham Campaign. These protests caused Kennedy to push for the passage of the bill, but unfortunately it couldn't be passed before he was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson used JFK's death to push for the passage of the bill. Now, this is a landmark case for civil rights legislation, and although it is huge, racial tensions are still high, and there is still much progress to be made.
Thanks, guys. Thursday, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was shot at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. King was in town to address a gathering at the Mason Temple. Prior to his arrival, MLK received many death threats due to his prominence in the civil rights movement. He taught that the murder could not stop struggle for equal rights, and he is turning out to be right. On April 3rd, King's Memphis flight was delayed due to a bomb threat, but he still managed to make his scheduled speech. MLK was staying at the Lorraine Hotel in room 308, one that he repeatedly resided in during his time in Memphis. After the fatal shot, the suspect, James O. Ray, fled the scene. A worldwide manhunt was triggered. 2 months later, Ray was arrested in London at the Heathrow Airport. He was extradited to the U.S. and charged with the crime. He pled guilty to avoid a trial conviction and potential sentencing under the death penalty. King's last speech was titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." He was 39.
Good afternoon. I'm live from Siberia with my Siberian wolves. I'm here to give a current update on an overview of the U.S. status with the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was an extraordinarily close call. We as Americans are lucky to have almost escaped total destruction. Soviet missiles have been taken out of Cuba, as well as our own missiles have been taken out of Turkey. Tensions continue to increase with the Soviet Union as communist influence spread throughout the East. The Berlin Wall continues to separate West Berlin and East Berlin. Families and friends are separated from each other, while the Soviets arm the wall 24/7 and shoot down any people trying to escape. Meanwhile, the space race continues, and although Russia was the first to put a man in space, we, as America, are planning to launch Apollo 11 and send a man to the moon. A partial ban treaty has been signed between the USSR and USA to ban any atmosphere nuclear testing and will only allow underground testing. Hopefully this may be a step towards nuclear peace, but China has become the 5th world nuclear power after successfully detonating a nuclear bomb. And other news, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which spiraled into the Vietnam War, we have finally begun Vietnamization and have begun taking our troops out of Vietnam. Protesters from anti-war movements are happy to see our men come home after numerous casualties. In all, we have continued to make strides in the containment of communism as well as keep the peace on our home front. Advancements in science and technology are quickly allowing us to one-up the Soviet Union and hopefully, in the future, put an end to communism.
Alright, that about wraps up our decades recap. Now, let's wait for the countdown to celebrate the coming of the new year. Have a good night.